Dunkirk was one of my absolute favorite films of 2017. It felt like such a change of pace from the typical Hollywood-produced war film of the past decade, what with its unique structure, beautiful cinematography, unbelievable sound design, and absolutely brilliant direction from legendary filmmaker Christopher Nolan. All these aspects are fantastically utilized into crafting a visceral theater-going experience, but there's one element to this film that really resonated with me. Its use of visual cues to establish setting, character, conflict, and most importantly, a goal in as short amount of time and with little dialogue as possible. This element is what brings the movie from great to impressive, as it treats itself very much like a silent era film in that regard, trusting in the audience to pick up on what the images are saying rather than what is being told to them. To illustrate this idea, let's look back at an actual film from the silent era, Charlie Chaplin's The Immigrant from 1917, and see how some of the techniques used here may have influenced how Dunkirk conveyed its information visually. In the opening of The Immigrant, Charlie Chaplin conveys the setting through both literal and emotional perspectives. The first shot is what clearly defines the setting as a specific place and time. A large ship on the open sea that is carrying hundreds of European immigrants to the United States. However, within the following shots, it is revealed what this place represents emotionally. A cold, rocky, cramped, and overall unpleasant midway point for a whole lot of people waiting for something better. All of this is shown in only 4 shots, 13 seconds total, beginning with the aforementioned exterior shot of the boat, followed up by a cut to an establishment of just a large amount of people all cluttered up on the floor of the vessel, then to a medium shot of 2 women, one young and one old, cradling each other for warmth and comfort, and then finishing off this establishment with a slow tilting shot up to the protagonist of the film, Charlie. It's also important to note how every single shot following the exterior of the boat has an added back and forth canted motion to further emphasize the physical and emotional setting of this specific boat. Now, how does Dunkirk compare in establishing its setting? By establishing its setting in a single shot. Within the opening shot of this film, we see everything we need to know about where these characters are. Scared, yet valiantly walking down a narrow road in a seemingly nice, if not completely desolate neighborhood. They are completely alone and have nowhere to go but forward. This is going to be a little bit more difficult to talk about, considering how Dunkirk takes emphasis away from the very specific character beats so as to focus more on the overall event taking place, while The Immigrant is all about the character of Charlie Chaplin and the comedy that comes from his antics. However, there are still some clearly similar techniques utilized in both films to establish a baseline of who the character is and what makes them important. For instance, in The Immigrant, Charlie is first introduced as a bit of a lovable oaf. He is seen holding himself over the rail of the boat until he pulls himself up while gleefully showing off the fish he had just caught. The fish then twitches out of his hands and into the horde of sleeping immigrants, much to the dismay of one of the men there, to which Charlie responds with an affirmative sigh. Throughout all of this, it is clear that he is important, as he is the only passenger here to let himself live past the hardships of the boat, which may come off as odd and silly to both the passengers and the audience, but it's still a crucial aspect to his character that makes him stick out from the rest. Going over to Dunkirk, a very integral aspect to the establishment of the characters is how they react to the setting they are in, almost exactly like in The Immigrant. However, in here it's not a sense of optimism and naivety that makes one character stand out from the rest, but instead it is the fear, dread, and desperation that binds these soldiers together. With every hesitated movement, every look of complete despair, every search for some form of safety, and even with the first position we see them in being a defensive crouch for their own safety, this event is what makes these characters autonomous, which is why it creates an interesting dynamic once all of the soldiers are killed in action, except for one, who narrowly escapes the gunfire and is able to find himself back in British hands. Now, why was this specific character important enough to keep him alive? Simple answer, he wasn't. The fact that he, out of all the other soldiers, was the sole survivor seems to be more incidental than anything else. Again, completely stripping away any sort of true individuality within his specific line of soldiers, and yet establishing a commonality between their shared emotions. Now this is where the two films feel remarkably similar. The established conflict and goal of each protagonist can be concisely described in one overall statement. The protagonists of both The Immigrant and Dunkirk must survive the dangerous conditions of their respective environments and the people within them in order to find their way home, or a place of comfort. Both films deal with very intense situations that the protagonist hope to get out of. However, The Immigrant is much more complex and figurative in how it portrays its central conflict and goals, as opposed to the heavily literal survival that is portrayed in Dunkirk. For instance, Charlie's central conflict of being on such a gross, unsafe boat with a slew of shady characters is not necessarily established as a life or death situation, but rather as more of an inconvenient one. A means of bringing down his spirits that will seem to slowly work their way into his psyche until he meets his love interest, or better yet, his ultimate goal. Charlie sees this woman in the dining hall and immediately falls in love, and from this point onward, it is his hope that he can soon charm her into marrying him that keeps him alive. He has found his true home, his real place of comfort, and it's with this beautiful woman. Going back over to Dunkirk, it is clear that the complexity of what the protagonist is overcoming and what they are looking to gain are not as prominent as in The Immigrant, at least not in the writing. However, it is solely within the shots and moment-to-moment character actions where the subtlety and nuances of this protagonist's mind come to the forefront. During the second and third shots of the opening sequence, it is established that these soldiers are quite literally surrounded by the enemy and need to find their way out of there. This conflict is quite devastating in how quickly yet brutally it is revealed to both the audience and characters, and it's through this conflict that each soldier searches for their own method of survival. An unlocked door to a safe house, some running water out of a garden hose, or even a used cigarette. They are all looking for something to ease their pain, but in the end they falter and die at the hands of the enemy. This is when the remaining survivor is brought back into British arm, and walks out onto the beach, where he sees lines and lines of British soldiers waiting for their turn to be taken out of this battlefield. And it is here where our protagonist fully realizes what his ultimate goal, his light at the end of the tunnel is. He wants to go home.